Hi, everybody. My name is Toni Ann Marcolini. Welcome to the podcast. It may interest you to know. Uh, I have a guest with me today, as I always do, Frank Collerius. And he is, I would, I think we call you manager of the New York Public Library, but we're going to get into that in 1 second. Uh, I'm very excited to have him here today because if you listen to the podcast, you know I'm somewhat obsessed with libraries, have been my whole life. Books are my thing. So I wanted to talk to Frank. So welcome, Frank.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
I am a huge fan of your podcast, The Librarian is In. Although you haven't done a new episode in a very long time, so I want to talk to you about what happened. Where are you?
I don't
Uh,
know. I mean, hiatus. I'm gonna make you louder. I think there's so much post-pandemic rearrangement and discovery. I think we're just rethinking what to do exactly. And sometimes things take a long time to get it together, but I really appreciate your enthusiasm. I think that's really, to be honest, one reason why I wanted to do this. I was like, if they're a fan of the podcast, I have to do this because that goes right to the heart of my ego, and I sort of love that. So, because you never know when you might not. I don't know if you know. I guess you feel the same way in some ways, or I'm just not so technologically adept that way. Is that I don't even know. I didn't even know who was listening until or how many. Or I didn't look up those statistics, but when I would get comments or emails or letters, even from as far away as Japan, I mean, it would be like, oh, and I'm sure you've experienced that
yeah.
with yours, and you're like, wow, the reach of this technology is pretty amazing. Um, and not even so much numbers sometimes as just the quality of the listener, of like who's listening and why. I mean, that seems to be more important to me. So we'll see. We'll see what the future brings, but thank you for asking. I appreciate that.
Sure. With your podcast, you always had a co-host, and Crystal was the last one.
Yeah.
Uh, and you basically talked about books in the library and certainly while you were doing the remodel in your library. Let's talk a little bit about your particular library too. It's historical, and the building itself is historical. Can you talk a little bit about it? Jefferson Market in Manhattan.
Uh-huh.
And can you talk a little bit about the history of your particular library?
I mean, I guess you have a lawyer brain, but you're also it's a fan because like I love how you know what you're talking about. It's very flattering to someone when someone actually when you realize you've been listened to. So I appreciate that. Okay, I'm going to stop with appreciation and just let all the ego out. So my library, Jefferson Market, is. Have you been, by the way?
I have never been to yours. I
Yeah.
mean, truthfully, I've really only been to libraries in New Jersey and in Brooklyn, and Staten Island. So that's the progression, born in Brooklyn, went to Staten Island, now in New Jersey, but I've never been to another library really outside of those areas. I've never been to Manhattan Library, although I would love to.
Yeah, I mean, actually, what I love about that is what it says about having a local library. It's like that they can be destinations. I think Jefferson Market, the library I work in, can be a destination branch. We're near the PATH train, things like that. But it's what you just said actually is far nicer in some ways because we all have our local libraries and they have meaning for us. So Jefferson Market is actually also my local library. I live around here in the village. And it was just happenstance, really, that I ended up getting here. I didn't aim for it. It wasn't like my goal. But now that I have achieved it, I feel so grateful that I'm here because it is an amazing building and has an incredible history. It's one of those examples of a building that was built for one purpose and then converted to another. It was originally a courthouse and is now a library. Um, and the whole story of that is probably one of my favorite stories because it relates to the community and it relates to people and it relates to the activization of people and to get what they want or what they think the community needs. Because once it was on whatever the word is, unsanctioned or stopped being a courthouse, like just after World War II, it was sort of just dormant for a while. It just was more than 10 years, it was pretty much abandoned and just empty. Used by some groups, but like for the most part, not used. If you can imagine real estate in Manhattan staying empty for so long, but I guess there are storefronts that are empty for a while, things like that. But the community got together and decided to save the building. And what I really love too also is that at the time in the late 50s, modernism, like architectural modernism of glass towers and clean lines and that kind of architecture was very much in vogue. And this building, which is a Victorian Gothic Italianite, no one can quite land exactly what it is, ornate building, was considered by some to be not that beautiful and sort of just like knock it down and build something, clean and fresh. And the community was like, no, we're going to save this building. So they did, and they did it without landmarks protection. There was no landmarking then, as you know, probably the story of Old Penn Station, which was demolished and much mourned. There were no landmarks protection yet until the mid-60s. So the community, and this is the core for me, did it without that legal backup. They did it on their own. And there was a lot of, like, if you read the press at the time, which is amazing, like there was a lot of fight about it. There were people who were convinced it should be knocked down, and the community saved it. And not only did they save it, they wanted it to be a public space, which is like the cherry on top to me. It's like not something private, but something for everyone. And so it was converted to a branch of the New York Public Library. And that was in 67. So here we are all these years later and still a community service. So I love that story about how the public got together to save it without anything but their own, brains and activist impulse, which is very village too.
Well, the
So
thing, the thing about a library that brings a community together, I think in a way that almost nothing else does, right? Because especially now, I mean, now it's not even just books, right? Like
yeah.
now you can you can check out almost anything, a movie, CD, and there's so much in the entertainment, genre that's available in the library now. But you can go in the library at any given moment, right? And look to the left or the right, right? And you'll have, you'll see somebody, I mean, that you recognize or that represents your community. All right. There's always like there's the two, like my library local has even a chess board out, so you'll see the two old guys playing chess, right? You'll see the kids at the tables, maybe, some college kids, doing work. You'll always see people who are just relaxing and reading and who's, checking out a video game or, you can look everywhere and you see like just a melting pot of your community, right there. And some place you can go, you can show up when you open and be there till you close. And it's just like a quiet place to sit and to be. And now they even have passes, right? Which a lot of people don't know. And I'm always surprised by that, right? You can go to your local library and they'll offer you passes to things,
I
to a
mean, like
museum.
museums.
Yeah, like to meet
Yeah.
like museum passes, right? So you can have, you can check it out of the library, which gives you a free pass to go to a museum, which ordinarily you'd pay for. Sometimes even like amusement parks,
Mhm.
aquariums, like all different opportunities for families that don't have money. You can go check those things out, and they'll give you the pass for a couple of days, a weekend, and whatever, and even that
Yeah.
is offered to you. I mean,
Mhm.
libraries are just wonderful places. Uh,
Yeah, they are. They're interesting spaces, and you can go in so many different directions. Because in thinking about this, like I anticipated you asking, like, what do libraries mean to me, and you just told one version of what libraries can do, and it made me think there's there can be so many ways to look at it. And what you just said was absolutely true. Like the library endeavoring to offer the public for free something that's valued in the culture, like something in their world that the library can then say, here, you have access to it. We're not going to charge you. You can come in, you don't have to buy anything. I mean, that alone is sort of like an amazing thing that you can just exist with no time limit, with no expectation. But yet there is then that aspect of sociability you just said, that there's a communal sharing aspect. I feel like libraries actually invite you to strengthen your sharing value. Because you are alone and private, at least we endeavor to make those spaces that way, but you are among other people.
Right.
And you are sharing that space. You're even sharing that book that you check out. Someone else checked it out before you, someone's going to check it out after you. And there's something sort of beautiful about that, I think. To have a
I
safe environment that gives you solace, but yet you're among your human fellows.
I agree. Now tell me, everybody's got their first library story, right? I remember my mom holding my little hand and walking me into the library, and I walked in, and I I knew, like, I had found my place in the world.
Yeah.
You know, like the harps were playing. I'm looking around, I'm like, this is my place. What's your
Yeah.
first library story?
It's an interesting thing about that because as what you can imagine for someone my age, is like what libraries were to us as children or young people before technology, for me, certainly, and what they are to me now, and also what they are to a young person now. I mean, like the typical old person's dilemma of like, what is true or what is just a function of my age, possibly. Because when you were saying what you just said, the overall memory of going to the library for the first times was this sense of pilgrimage to a building that contained stuff I couldn't get anywhere else. That was just an amazing place of like possibility. I mean, my favorite memory, and I still have a copy of this to this day, was that in the children's room there was a reading room section of picture books that I think that were used by the librarians to read to kids. And there was one on a retelling of Hansel and Gretel that I would make a beeline for every time I went, because I knew it would always be there, and it something that gave me incredible pleasure to pull off the shelf and then read. And it was an experience I couldn't find anywhere else. And I wonder now, there is a huge landscape of options for people, like to read online, to read on a device, to come to the library and get a book. And all of that is wonderful. And I honestly don't want to be on a road of diatribe against technology, which you could pick apart any aspect of human life and have criticism of it, whatever. But there is something about the journey. We talked about I talked about sharing before, like this values of human life. There is something about going to a place. Post-pandemic, I've discovered I feel very fond and believe in the small business, like the local corner deli that I get coffee at, the hardware store next to that, where if I need like a screwdriver, I go. The small clothes store, which I'll get socks at. Like I somehow value that experience, like a building in which a service is given to you, run by people ostensibly who care about that service. And there's a pleasure in that. And I feel like going to the library, going to a place that will give you value, there should be a bit of a journey. There should be a bit of an effort made. I think because it's meaning. You get meaning once you get there. And to me, a book that's a book, a physical book, it has this extra electricity of when I'm reading it, that it's between me and the author, and no one else knows I'm reading this book. It's like I'm not getting an algorithm that's gonna work me on that. It's somehow even feels even more sacred, to be highly dramatic, or just beautiful and humane. There's a humanity to it that before the internet I wouldn't have articulated that way, but post-internet I do. I don't know if that made any sense, but I sort of love the idea of everyone has their function, like the small business, the small family-owned operation, the library, the record store, which doesn't exist anymore, things like that, where I think I also don't like the object, like the phone that we have, all have, that I don't want everything to be on one device. If I want to read, I want to read. If I want to listen to music, I want to listen to. I mean, I like this sort of, I don't like the aggregate, but some people do, and that's fun, you know?
Well, and I will say too that for people who don't know, and I'm always surprised by this as well, the library actually does offer you the ability to check out books digitally,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you can get Libby or um Hoopla, right, on your phone, and you set it up with your library card, and your local library will also allow you to do that, right? So you can be checking things out for those people who want to read on their Nook or their Kindle. You can do that too.
Right.
Adding to my libraries are magnificent places that pretty much offer you whatever you need.
Hmm.
I
Right. There's a huge landscape of choice, and that,
right.
is a good thing. People listen to audiobooks on Libby all the time, and that's a huge thing. People come in to get cards, and then I sometimes say, like, well, see you in a year or two, like, because they're going to use things online, which is fine, and other people don't. I mean, back to Jefferson Market and its beauty, its physical beauty. I mean, you can see maybe part of the room behind me, I think is beautiful. Is is also now giving people an experience, like that aspect of experience, that when you come to the library to pick up your book, it's actually an experience walking up these amazing Victorian winding staircase, or being able to actually work on your laptop or read a book or do research in a beautiful room with these beautiful stained glass windows. I mean, that is an experience, and something that's not your home. It's not someplace you might work. It's not the park. It's not a coffee shop. It's this separate, free experience that hopefully can inspire, give you calmness, allow you to focus. That's the kind of experience we offer, I think. And that I love that you started this off with the sociability aspect. Speaking of sociability, I actually post-pandemic ran into a couple who met in the library and who
Mm,
are now married. They
nice.
they wanted to tell me, like, you know what, we met in the library and we're now married, and we wanted to tell you that this library sort of, inspired that relationship. And I was like, that's amazing. We're also a singles meetup, hey. So many
It's
ways to meet other people in your community.
It certainly is, though, an opportunity to meet other people in your community. I mean,
Yeah,
because the library even will have uh once in a while, besides of course there are authors that come and do readings and signings. You can find them at the library as well. But libraries will also have, a class on basket weaving, right? And they'll rent out a room, and you'll have, somebody come in who's teaching something, have like a little mini seminar. There's the children's room, right, where can take your kids for story time.
right. It's
Most
happening
all
right
libraries.
now, actually, downstairs.
Right, most all libraries have that, like an opportunity where you bring your kids and somebody reads them a story, um, and the kids are very quiet, and they love that. And then that's their first experience, I think with libraries. For many people, they do remember story time and going there as a child, and that helps them have that love or that passion for the library, which, I mean, I've had my whole life, a love of books, a passion for the library, which my mother instilled in me and is with me always. Like today, it never left. And I think that's important, that people do that for their kids. That's such a great gift you can give your kids, that
Yeah.
passion for books and for the libraries. You can count on the library, right? No matter where you go in the world, there's a local library
Yeah.
to you. And they're usually representative of the community. They're always offering something for the community. Even during the pandemic, a lot of libraries, they were there, right? They were,
Yeah.
even though you couldn't go in, you could call the librarian, did your research for you, or got your books for you and met you at the window, right? To
Right.
still check out through the pandemic. They were there to say, "Hey, while you guys are home, read a book. You want to check out your video game or your movie, and we're gonna be here." Librarians came in and showed up. I mean, there's a long history of librarians, and I could go on and on. There's books about World War II and how the
Yeah.
librarians and how librarians have saved libraries and books from other countries, certainly, and gotten books out. And um, I
Yeah.
just I think the world of librarians and the people who work at the library, because often they have that passion and for books and for the place that I think we should all have. And that's one of the things I like to do. I focus on creativity on the podcast, but that comes in all forms. And I think many people who work in the library have that reverence for creativity.
Mhm.
And that's part of the journey for them, right?
That's actually a good point because certain points of my life I thought about how cool it would be to be an artist, and as I've gotten older, I've realized I love rather than being the artist, I love facilitating the artist. You said something about community and finding it and serving that community. It's like I do believe after so many years of being here that a librarian who can serve in any capacity in any neighborhood. I started in the Bronx, I was on the Upper East Side, I was down all over the city. And I think eventually though, in some ways you have to find your community and whatever that is, because it's not one monolith of one kind of person. It could be a lot of kinds of people, but you sort of develop with your community of what to offer them. And something you said made me realize one of the things I love to do is to sort of add value to someone's life. It's like we are in our brains forever. We only have this little area, and to enhance the value of what you feed it, because you spend time with it, you think, to give you language to actually formulate new thoughts about yourself, about who you are, about what your world is so important to me because I realize how much we spend with just our own heads. And the ability to focus and to figure out your own self is such an important thing. So to that end, like one of my things I love to do is to engage local professors from the local universities like the New School and NYU and other universities, and they teach classes here for the public. The public can attend for free. And I love the idea, first of all, that you can take a class in philosophy or in playwriting or in whatever and do it for free, but also to engage with a local academic as someone who's technically inspired and an expert or enthusiastic about their field and share that with a very diverse public. Whenever I talk to the professors who teach here, I always say the challenge you'll have is you'll have a very diverse crew of people, some with no undergrad experience, some with masters, some who are curious, some who are proficient, and almost all of the professors say that's exciting to them to encounter that because in their institutions they teach one level and I sort of love that meeting of the community with someone in the neighborhood, in the community that can exchange ideas with them and maybe give them something new to think about. I love doing that. So you reminded me of the way we develop services. Like that came to me one day when I was checking out a book to a patron who was taking an adult continuing ed class at the university. And I was like, why don't we do that?
Why not? Right? Why
Yeah,
not indeed?
that's how it works. Like that's how as you said, a service-oriented person, you said passion is thinking and inspired to then say, we can do that here for the public and they can attend it for free.
And I find that the public actually turns out, right? These are things that you don't even know you want until you hear that it's available to
Exactly. That's
you.
exactly the best way to put it. And then it's the not being afraid to try it. Because a librarian's biggest fear sometimes is like, nobody's going to come to my program. And then, I've certainly over the years gotten over that because I'm just like, don't bother, just try it because you never know. And then you see who comes in the door and you're like, whoa, this is amazing. So you have to try, take chances and see what works and what doesn't work.
So now what's your journey, Frank? How do you wind up there?
I mean, literally, or
No, well, I think I know that, but I mean, um, no, how do you wind up at your particular library or working for the library? I have to assume that the library meant something to you maybe when you were young.
oh, oh, you mean like professional journey?
Yeah, what's your profession? How do you wind up working at the library and then managing it? I mean, that's a big deal.
Right. It's interesting. Well, it's like, I guess books was the starting point, as you've indicated about yourself, and that I was thinking of publishing when I was younger for a long time. Other artistic endeavors, as at the same time in that pot of like, what am I going to be? And then when it really became like a matter of what am I going to do, I thought of publishing first, which I'm grateful I went towards libraries because to be in a nonprofit is actually very important to me. To not always be thinking about what you're doing as having to make some money or be a profit making. Maybe I don't think that's completely the ethos in publishing because it's still labors of love, I think. But also it is a money making enterprise, which is fine. I'm just glad I'm doing what I do. But so by the time I got out of college and was knocking around in bookstores for a couple of years, it was almost too old to get into publishing, at least at the time, because usually you start very low and you work your way up. And I went on a couple of interviews and I sensed that they were like, you know too much or something. I don't know. It was very interesting. And then I was always interested in libraries and sort of fiddled around with the idea of going to library school because I found libraries like you did as a child to be like these sanctuaries of amazingness. And so one day I saw in the New York Times an open house for a library job, and I went to the library I was living on Long Island I grew up on Long Island. And went to this open house on a rainy day. And I remember, I always remember thinking when it was raining and it was a terrible weather day. And I remember thinking, oh, just forget it. Just don't do this. And I was going to turn around, but I ended up going in and I went in and then we had these interviews and eventually got the job. I got a job. And that's how it started. This is like it was 92, before the internet. So I started in the Bronx and it was amazing. I had an amazing experience there. And then worked my way to like you start as trainees and you work your way up through different levels. And
Right.
my role has been called branch librarian, branch manager, library manager. And I think now that I look back, I never really wanted to go beyond this role. I wanted to stay on the front line, but I wanted to have the managerial role primarily because I wanted my vision to be able to manifest. I wanted to say, I want to do this program with these professors and have no one particularly able to say no. Like if I had a boss on site, I'd be like, can we do this? And they'd be like, no, it sounds like too much work. I don't do it. I'd be
Yeah.
unhappy. So I was never more happy than when I was just a regular librarian because it was pure creativity in a lot of ways. But I could probably not go because managing obviously can be stressful and has a lot of different moving parts and it's not all like just creativity, it's like administration and stuff like that, which is necessary. But I don't think I could go back because I like being able to have an idea and then make it happen.
Sure. I mean, you used to talk about that even a lot on your own podcast.
Yeah.
You talk about, what was coming up. I will say that I wound up reading Anna Karina because of you.
Oh, wow. I'm
I never wanted to read it. It was just like long and daunting and just didn't hold any appeal for me. And then you started kind of serializing it for us on the podcast. I used to commute a lot, so I don't anymore, but I used to. Uh, and and so I would always have your podcast on while I was driving in the car, and you started talking about it. And it's a tremendously long book,
Yeah.
and you started talking about it in sections across the podcast. I was like, I'm going to throw the towel in. I'm going to go do it.
And
So you inspired me to read it. Uh,
yeah.
yeah, I will say that I don't want to turn anybody else off to the book, but you made it more exciting than I think it actually was.
It's so interesting. It's like the biggest anxiety about reading that book, Anna Karenina, is of its length. I don't know what it is about human brains that we look at could be in the moment and reading the page, and then we see there's 1,000 more pages, and it somehow overwhelms us. I think I talked in the podcast that was one of the things I had to let go of, like, or tried to let go of, is that sense of overwhelm and just read the story. And um, I don't know if that was your experience per se, but I found it to be an amazing experience because I almost, when I finished that book, and obviously there's a difference of opinion here, which is fine. I felt like, how could anyone even attempt to write fiction after reading that? Because it's like the ultimate novel to me in a way. It's like it has everything in it.
Oh, there's a lot going on. I'll
There's a
give you
lot going on, and Tolstoy just like can nail a moment of humanity unbelievably, I think. Like it's not like a soap opera in that it's a lot of pyrotechnics and emotion purely for just melodrama. There's like a real existential literariness to it that is amazing. And it's translated, which is a whole other issue of discussion about translated books, because it's almost like reading the work of two authors in some way. Anyway, the fact that you're inspired to read it is like what a library is all about. Like, I'm glad it was inspiring for you to try it out. Now you can say you read it.
Yeah,
You can
I
show
can
off
see
at
it.
a cocktail party and be like, I've read Anna Karenina. Not so great. But you did it. It's off your
I
list.
didn't dislike it, but I thought I think you really made it exciting, the story.
Oh, wow.
Um, so I owe I guess not only reading it, but my appreciation for it, I think really was inspired by because it's like, all right, so he feels so passionate about it. You kind of share that. You bubbled over a little bit with that. So I was like, oh, okay. And then
Oh,
as you were going along, I was like, well, this story is kind of interesting. This is a little bit wild. I'm all about literary fiction's my favorite, right? I read mysteries, I read biographies, history, I read everything but science fiction. It's the only thing I just can't get excited about. But otherwise I read pretty much everything. But literary fiction is the thing I enjoy the most. I'm all about those messy, multi-generational, backstory, a whole lot of stuff going on. I'm
yeah.
about those kind of things, books, but uh I don't know what I was expecting. I had been avoiding that book for a long time. And then when you
Right.
started, like I said, serializing it, because you talk about it across several of your podcasts, uh, you inspired me and I finally bit the bullet and did it.
Well, good for you. All right, so you're talking books. Like it's inspiring just to hear you. Because the first thing I thought was, have you read a book called North Woods by
I haven't. Tell me.
Daniel Mason? When you said, I sort of love what you just said, multi-generational. I don't know. I'm gonna read it for our book club, book discussion group here, because it just my choices happen very organically when it happens, and I've heard about it, but it's sort of the premise is intriguing. I think it has to do with a house that like it's a history of a house and all the families that have gone through it. And something is very appealing about that, something poignant and it's lovely. So that's what I want to read coming up. And then you mentioned you don't read sci-fi. And
I
I'm
don't.
not
I
really a
just
big
can't
sci-fi
do it.
reader either, but I force myself to. And with Crystal on the podcast, like she would read it and we would read it
Yeah.
together. And I always appreciated it because it was getting out of my natural choices. And sometimes you really can discover wonderful things. And I just read a classic sci-fi author, Ursula Le Guin, who wrote The Left Hand of Darkness. She's a classic writer of science fiction and fantasy. And I read a book called The Dispossessed by her. And what you might key into in terms of reading sci-fi as well as for me is that certain science fiction writers like Le Guin, Le Guin, I don't know how to say your name perfectly. They're really idea books about human beings set in a fantastical environment to facilitate those ideas. So the Dispossessed is a lot about government and people autocracies and all this stuff that we still think about now, obviously. And so that might be a way into sci-fi for you if you want to try it, because you find the authors that are not just purely like Star Wars, but even like, a Star Wars fan will be like, it's not just about the sabers,
Yeah.
it's about ideas and things like that. So I've discovered a satisfaction in reading, but I have to be pushed slash inspired to read out of my literary fiction zone too. I have the same as you do. I'd love to read more mysteries, like just more fun
I
stuff.
do read a lot of mysteries too. I mean, because I do enjoy them, and once in a while you get a book that like Lori Roy just wrote a book. She was on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. Um that I thought kind of had an overlap with literary fiction, right? Because it was just a messy backstory between all these people. Like there was a lot going on, and she fictionalized Marilyn Monroe and put her in the book,
Oh, interesting.
and then like this, so there's like a couple of mysteries going on simultaneous to this just messy life story. Um, and that I really enjoyed. I do like when you bring them together. And then I'm also somebody who, my guilty pleasure, I always say, is like the Stephanie Plum novels, Janet Ivanovich. Like I'll gobble them up as they come out. And that's more of like a guilty pleasure for me because I feel like I'm a bit of a snob sometimes, which I don't like. When it comes to reading, I really do like the literary fiction best, but I read a lot of other stuff too that I really enjoy, and that absolutely has its place.
I
Uh,
wonder again, what you were just saying, I wonder what we mean when we say guilty pleasure.
well,
Because
I
I know
feel
what
like
of course, I know what you mean. Sometimes I think it's like when I read, I was, of course, thinking about this, knowing I was going to be on your podcast. Reading can be, and I almost want it to be a somewhat anxious slash, you know, existential experience because I'm always just wanting to discover meaning and to get what the author's saying and have those words really penetrate and really understand them. And when I read something that I consider guilty pleasure, it's because the pressure's off. Like I don't feel like I have to understand every second of the book, but I do value that, but that there is such a pleasure in, oh, I can just like read for 20 minutes before bed and feel great about it. I don't often read what I would call a guilty pleasure. That's why I even said I should read more mysteries or something that's considered like a genre. Because when I do, I really think, oh, this is such a relief.
right, you're not looking for themes. You're
Yeah.
not, figuring out like what am I supposed to be absorbing. Most literary fiction, let's face it, it has some overriding theme. It's highlighting some
Yeah.
human condition, and you're usually thinking while you're reading and you're absorbed in the world. Um, but with mysteries and some other types of work, it's not quite the same, right? That you're
Right.
just along for the ride. It's just like super cool. You're along for this mystery while this
Yeah,
person investigates, and
absolutely.
you're like, ah, just something's off with this guy. I feel it. Like it's more entertainment in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much to say about that. I mean, there's also just like the mind, your mind creating visuals can be so exciting. I mean, like your brain in conjunction with the author's words, like can sometimes make such intense magic that like, a movie can't quite meet, even though movies are amazing. I sometimes think of that when you put down a book, like I don't know if you're a night owl. I tend to be a very late night person at 2 in the morning, and you look up and suddenly the world seems slightly altered, because you've been immersed in these words and their own sort of visual creation in your own head. And that to me is the feeling of like amazement. Like that's the great feeling of reading a book, that communion with those words that create that feeling. Um, it's sort of nothing like it. I don't know.
I agree with you. There's nothing like a good book.
Yeah.
Right? I may say I'm a cancer survivor,
Yeah.
right? And I often say you never know. You meet your reader where they are, right? And to me, reading was a way to get lost in another world, like to kind of escape out of what I was going through at that time. really books have been, I remember being a kid, even in the schoolyard, and I didn't want to play in the schoolyard. Like I wanted to go into the library and finish reading the book I was reading. Right? Like I was just books have been for me. They've just held a special place my whole life. And I'm not alone, right? There are a lot of readers who started reading young, Nancy
Yeah.
Drew and the Hardy Boys and like started, as even before that with the little, I remember the little books with the Cinderella, you start with those little stories when you're young and you just keep going. People who love books tend to be passionate their whole life about books.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and the thing I talked about in the later episodes of the podcast is that sort of revelation of like, wow, we have as a more mature reader, we have these human experiences like you just referred to your own, and books really can give us the language to describe it more accurately for what we're feeling. It's really just that human feeling. What is the feeling I'm feeling? By reading, I think, is the one major way we can get the language to describe that. Like, what am I? What's going on with me right now?
Yeah.
I feel like the aggregate of reading books give you that ability. That's why I take it so seriously, and I relish that seriousness about it because it's like phrase or a concept that you read can suddenly change the way your worldview is, you know?
Sure. Now you have to be in a position though. You're in the library day in, day out. You have to have some good stories, I would think about people who came in maybe struggling, they don't read that much, or you found them just the right book. I know that people have to be relying upon you sometimes for your advice. Do you have a particular story that sticks with you, like that gave you a sense of satisfaction?
Oh my God, you're talking about 30 years of stories. I mean, there's so many.
I'm sure.
I mean,
I'm sure
there
because
are
really
too
you're pretty
many. I mean, that I now suddenly feel horrible because I want to give you the most perfect story and I know they're there. But suddenly, it's somehow, it could be a slightly egocentric thing that the stories are flying away because it sounds very self-aggrandizing to get these, but they personally give so much pleasure. Um, oh, there's so many. I mean, when you talk about somebody and you give them a book and they tell you later how amazing it was, that's just a basic librarian story that's wonderful. And you connect in that way. And then this that relationship between that person you've recommended the book and you is slightly different if they're regulars to the library, because every time you see them, you have that connection of that book. And you know that you're the one that gave it to them and they had no clue of it. And that has certainly happened. So, but there's times I walk around the library and it seeing people in their endeavors, like seeing what they're doing and how they're using the spaces that we took so much energy to create. Like everything in this building through so many other people is designed intentionally about where the chairs are, where the carpets are, where the books are, where everything. And to see people utilize the space in such diverse ways is very satisfying to me. It's not a specific story. I now I'm mad because I can't give you a kapow story, but maybe I'll come to me. But I do love lately doing that, just literally walking around this building and seeing how people are using it, reading,
sure.
studying, meaning, just the choice.
How
You know,
how horrible was it during the pandemic not to have people there?
it was just a strange time. It was just what it was, and I guess there was overriding concerns at the time about the pandemic itself, but eventually. As that because the pandemic occurred at the same time we were under renovation, as you referred to as
Right.
well. So when the pandemic ebbed a bit and work resumed, the renovation begun again, and then it was more weird because then the world was coming back and we weren't yet. Um, we weren't back yet. So then it felt strange, but I'm so glad that it's over and the renovation is such a success. So but it was strange a little bit there to see it dusty and Miss Havisham-y. If people get that reference from Charles Dickens. Great Expectations, sort of unused and like stopped in time because like the furniture, everything was sort of, when we shut down, it was just where it was. It was very interesting. I used to walk around here and be like a ghost in my own building, but yeah.
Well, and one of the things I enjoyed so much about your podcast is that you and Crystal didn't read the same thing,
Mhm.
right? A lot of times you didn't. And so when you got together, you'd be chatting about, you tell her about your book, she would tell you about her book, books you wanted to read, books you have read. And for, the people out there who love the library, who love reading, that was a true source of, because there were other books that, and I guess that's what I was thinking about in terms of recommendation. There were other books, usually that you were talking about. I think I was more attracted to your book, your style of reading than I was Crystal's, but
Yeah.
pardon me?
Yeah. I mean, well,
Yeah.
we seem to have the same, like the literary fiction aspect and that kind of thing. It's always fun to talk to her because she had definitely a different approach to it, just like all the co-hosts did. I know if you
Yeah.
listen from Gwen and Rhonda.
And
Anyway.
then like you started, you would each start chatting about it. And there were other recommendations that I felt like I got um just from listening to something you were talking about, or you said, I'm gonna read, or this is something new coming out, or um so I thought your podcast was great in that regard too. For people who don't, there are people who are shy or for whatever reason don't even think to go ask the librarian for recommendations, but the library is, it's got everything. Right. So where to begin to find, your perfect, your perfect match. And I thought that your podcast definitely served that. So I do hope it comes back.
Oh,
You had a lot of listeners who were like, oh, wow. Like, and got to hear a recommendation of something that drove them to that book.
well, that's lovely to hear. Thank you. I appreciate that. We'll see. We'll see what happens as we journey onward in the library world.
What's your favorite part of your job?
What's my favorite part? I mean, these questions, like things can be reduced to that, but I think what I just said, I've been here so long that who was I telling this to? Forgot. I was just telling this to somebody. Some of my favorite parts of my job now, at this point in my career, I probably would answer it differently in different times. I talked about some of the services we do that give me great pleasure, but literally, what these days gives me the most pleasure is the simple act of certain library tasks. Literally, I we have pages, the high school kids who shelve books, but I will shelve something, and that gives me such pleasure. And seeing it's really being out on the floor, doing something like a finite task, because sometimes my job can be so in my head, and we're also trying to make something happen that might take a long time. So doing something that is like finishing from beginning to end a task is very pleasurable. So, and like I said before, I like shelving, so being out on the floor and seeing how people are interacting with the space, because I guess I can't underestimate it, is that since I've been here 25 years, it's like all the spaces have been redone by me and the people I work with. So it means a lot to me to create that environment once I realized how much a physical environment can orient your head. Because when I first got here, it's like there was, well, not casting aspersions, but like I figured out certain things about people that I love to employ. For example, you said what I like to do. I figured out to get an appropriate table for people, I wanted to give people at least 4 feet of personal space between the next chair. Because when I first got here, the tables were only 5 feet, so people had 2.5 feet of personal space. I mean, something like that gives me an incredible pleasure to realize. And I noticed that every other chair wouldn't be filled because it was too close. So the idea of creating a table where people have 4 feet of space and seeing every chair filled with a person, because everyone feels like, oh, I can be near a person, but I have my own private little space, is very satisfying. So
Sure.
like I almost thought mathematically something that is an emotional experience, So that gives me a lot of pleasure to see how people interact with the spaces and the books, the materials that we have.
Now, I know, like with research, right? A lot of people don't realize, if you're researching anything, the place to go is the library, right? Because they will, especially if it's something that happened in their community, they'll have a treasure trove of information. Oftentimes, libraries have like literally boxes of, historical information that's just there. Photographs, even of the neighborhood that can go back 100 years or more.
Yeah,
If you're looking at anything that happened, an historical event, a building, um, that's a place you can go, and often there's still pieces of that neighborhood, that Americana, that whatever happened there. There's the real life thing that you can lay your hands on. Um,
yeah,
and I love that too about libraries. It's a source of that type of historical record, even for a
yeah.
neighborhood.
See, that's a good point about I actually rely on colleagues who are better at that than I am. I, different librarians have different kinds of focuses or foci
Sure.
and different heads. And that you gave an good example. I didn't know I'd be here as long as I have. I just said 25 years. And one of my ideas when I first got here, because it's Greenwich Village, which is a famous community in the world, was to start an archive of ephemera and daily stuff like flyers or anything that was the life of the community and start that archive. And I just never really did it. And when I look back now, I'm like, I'd have 25 years of history if I did that, which is crazy that I didn't do it. But I work with somebody I hired specifically who is actually organizing all the papers. We found, this is like a librarian dream. We found a file cabinet during the renovation that I didn't know about that has a lot of papers from the conversion of the story I told at the beginning of this, of the conversion of the courthouse to a library. And I hired a librarian who is interested in archives, and she is actually archiving the entire cabinet, making it accessible to find out more about the history of this building. So you do work with different, not everyone can be everything. And like you even talked about recommending books. Sometimes somebody will ask me, like, I'm looking for a good sci-fi book. And I'm like, you know what? I am not the guy. But my colleague here can really give you something good. It's like you source the people together to do the best possible job. I find that I used to have an ego about it, like I have to do everything, but now I really realize the pleasures in saying, you're good at that, I'm not good at that. Like the archive, I wish I had more I love the idea of archives and using them, but I realized I'm not an archivist. I don't have the head for that organization. I'm not as detail oriented, I think, as some people are. Anyway, I just love that you brought up research, that this librarian is putting together this archive. And we get requests all the time about the history of the building and architecture students and adaptive reuse students about buildings that were created for one purpose and are now used for another. And this archive has served that need, and I love that. So I'm
Well,
very happy that she's doing it.
I know many authors who've told me, this was a real life murder or something that happened, and I went to the library and they were able to, there were 3 boxes worth of court transcripts and newspaper clippings. That's the place they go. Many writers will go to the library and say, I want to write about this in my book. I need to investigate. And the library is there. Uh,
Yeah.
I mean,
I
this is
mean,
source that most people don't credit and don't realize.
well, and also everyone, you might think you know the truth, like you might know the story. For an example, like I said again at the top of this, about the activists that saved the building from demolition. When I looked into the archives on local newspapers that wrote about this whole journey of the public saving this building, there were a lot of articles written by very sincere people about why this building should be demolished. And you, in other words, if you talk to someone now, like all the people who come into the library, the tourists, the users, the regulars, would be aghast at anybody possibly saying knocking this building down, because now like there's so few Victorian Gothic buildings in Manhattan that it's like such a unique, amazing
Landmark.
place. I mean, most people are just like, even if they don't like it, it's like an amazing thing that should be preserved. Like we need this history here. But there were lots of opinions at the time about people who were like making cogent cases to knock it down. And what I didn't quite realize till I read that was how there was a diversity of opinion. You'd think, who would be for knocking this building down? But like you said, reading the archive or reading the historical newspapers about what was happening at the time, rather than looking at it hindsight, was a real eye-opener to me, that I even made copies of some of these articles and shared them with the public to give them an idea of what happened. One of them was called, I'll never forget, it was called A Monstrosity. And they were referring to this building, that this building was a monstrosity that should be destroyed. Research, that's what it gives you perspective, it gives you the language, it gives you the viewpoint to discover what the truth of the event really was. And you're absolutely right.
Sure. So, I mean, I like to talk about libraries, I think, because I think this generation doesn't often appreciate uh, what they find in a library and what libraries are intended to be, right? Everyone is so addicted to digital, to their phone, that nobody realizes, hey, there's this place you can go.
Yeah.
That even if you want digital, but I mean, can offer you a lot more than digital, can offer you all these other things. And libraries just they're the core, aren't I mean, I think they're the core of most communities.
Well,
It doesn't matter your socioeconomic
yeah,
background, right? It doesn't matter if you have money or you don't. This is a place they'll give you stuff and you don't need to check out if, you don't need to pull into your wallet for it.
right. I
Um,
mean, I have to say that, and I know there have been articles written about this in the library world and in general media. Maybe you've come across them yourself, but I've also 100% noticed it anecdotally, just working in the libraries, that since we reopened about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, the biggest demographic to the biggest increase in the demographic to get library cards and check out physical books has been 20 somethings for sure. And we've noticed it on staff. I've then discovered there have been articles written about Gen Z going back to the libraries. And it's an incredibly pleasurable experience to check out these hefty books to a 25-year-old, you know? And I I mean, we could all prognosticate on why. I mean, I wonder if it is partly about a little bit of everything we've talked about, this sort of like disinterest in always being on the phone or always being on that thing. I mean, the experience of the journey to pick up a book that you will then savor, all those experiences that we talked about. But it's still a great thing to see that the book is indomitable, that there is a sense, and in libraries in some ways too, like these environments that we've created. So I was gonna say something else about technology. Just I sort of less interest. I think it's somehow my age or middle age or more can be somewhat more enamored of technology than a younger person these days, because it's just so second nature to them. It's just
right. I mean,
oh, I know what you're saying. Hmm?
they've grown up with a phone in
Right.
with their
But
thumb.
what I was gonna say about technology is, though, I don't think in my lifetime I've experienced a technology that was created, and the time span between its creation and between people saying how bad it is for you is so short. I mean, in the 70s when I was a kid, like the TV was always like, you shouldn't watch so much TV, but TV had been around 25 years by that point. It's like, the phone's been around since 2008, and it's like pretty quickly we were like, we're on it too much. Like it happens, it's so much more accelerated. And maybe that's a strength of books and libraries too, is that it sort of forces you to decelerate a little bit, to sort of, step by step you make that journey to pick up that book to then read it, is like a sense of real focus and serenity that it just can't quite fully exist with technology because it's too quick. Like the biggest thing that for me is like I was not a phone person, but the pandemic pushed a lot of people online. I feel like the pandemic did more to change libraries in some ways, some for good reasons, than the creation of the internet itself, because it forced almost everybody in some fashion online because there was no choice in some at some point you had to access something if you could get online. But I've noticed since we reopened and post-pandemic, a lot of the behaviors that existed before have come back, but in different ways. Like we used to have, when we opened the doors, it would be a rush for the newspapers, like a early morning rush to the newspapers. And now I noticed, I was like, oh, our newspaper people have gone. And then I noticed the newspapers get read a lot, but it's an afternoon event now. I mean, this sounds like a minor point, and I don't even know what it means, but it's a change in behavior, but that the behavior itself has come back, but it's
Yeah.
just different. Like there's no morning rush, but there's an afternoon leisurely reading of the newspaper. I don't know.
Again, another
Okay,
great
guys.
point you just brought out for people who can't afford maybe to get the paper delivered to them every day. You know, they take the walk to the library and there it is.
Right,
The
and also how many
newspaper.
times do you hear people say, I mean, all the time, oh my God, did you hear about blah, 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 a news story? And then you find out really that that person really just read the headline because it was on their phone. And when I watch these people in the library, it's like you're reading an article. Like you're getting a value out of it that's a little bit more, like I said, it's a little bit decelerated. It's forcing you to concentrate. And I find that extremely appealing. I think the value added to your own brain is enormous, to be honest, rather than just this breakneck thing. Yeah, I heard that story and I read the headline and I got the point. Maybe you didn't get the
Yeah,
point.
maybe that's the point.
Yeah, anyway.
Did you
Yes,
did you read
the
this?
libraries are wonderful.
Did you wind up reading that I think Susan Olson, I'm trying to think of the name of the book, but it's about the Los Angeles Public Library when they had the
Oh
fire.
yeah, yeah. Susan Orlean,
That's it.
the library book. Oh,
Yeah,
such a good book.
right.
Such a good
Such
book.
you did read it. I read it too.
Loved it. Yeah, very
It's
good.
like a love letter to librarians and to the library.
And I loved it because I find Los Angeles a very interesting city, and I thought the combination of she wrote beautifully about libraries and about that city particularly, and about that particular drama of that fire. I mean, it was a great story. She knows how to find a story. That's a great recommendation. Not even if you love libraries, it's almost like a great thriller in some ways, or
Yeah.
sociological thriller.
Yeah, I agree
Right.
with you. Is that she put and I remember reading it and thinking this is truly it's not the page turner that that some books can be, but
Right.
it's just such a lovely read. Right? It really is it's a love letter to a place that's meant so much to me.
Yeah.
And hearing about the history, not knowing about the fire, it's a really nice read.
Yeah. What I love to you a part of that book is when she talks about the regulars, like the from the viewpoint of the librarian, like the regulars that come in and how we don't know everybody by name. Some people we do, some people we don't. And you develop nicknames for them. And then what I thought from a librarian's point of view is, of course, we are like, oh, there's Pink Lady, it's pink all the time, whatever. And then they also, when if you start talking to people, you are a character to them as well. Like, oh, the tall librarian guy, or, like we have our own nicknames because we are a part of, that's the point I made before about the privacy in public. Like, we are a part of each other's lives. We might not be intimately connected in it. Well, actually, I wouldn't say that. I would say we might not be socially connected in terms of knowing each other's names all the time, but yet we are figures in each other's life, in daily life, because we see each other so often. It's a fascinating experience. So Susan Orlean writes in that book about the regulars that come into the library and what their behavior is and how they use the library. I love that part because it's sort of what I do live every day. Like I told you, I love watching, see people interact with the spaces and each other. So that's a good recommendation for somebody to read for sure.
Well, Frank, I thank you so
We've
much
been
for
talking for an hour here. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate the invitation. I really do. It's been a
I
pleasure.
hope you'll come back and keep talking to me about books.
Yeah, I know. I had all these recommendations, but we'll do another time. We actually talked about books organically, which is the way it should be.
Tell me, give me a recommendation. Give me
Well,
just
it wasn't
one.
recommendations, it was just what I was reading.
Tell me what
Um,
you're reading.
which it's I've read two books lately that are seemingly very different. One is the biography of Candy Darling, called Icon Superstar Dreamer by Cynthia Carr. Candy Darling was a figure in the 60s in Andy Warhol's factory scene, his movies that he made, and the underground sort of downtown theater slash movie scene. And Candy Darling was like a sort of progenitor of what we would call like a trans woman. And so this is the first full-length biography of her. And she grew up in the 40s on Long Island and moved to Manhattan, like so many of us did, to like go into the bohemian world where we could feel more accepted and find our people and find ourselves. So there's the biography of her. And the other book is called The Maniac by Benjamin Labatut, which is a lot about the scientists and mathematicians who created the bomb, which is contingent with the release of Oppenheimer, the movie. And I was thinking about these two very different books, and then because I did this on the podcast all the time, and I don't know if I actually I make this happen because I needed to or it naturally occurs, but I suddenly saw similarities in each of the books because in The Maniac, this scientist Johnny von Neumann, who was really the brains behind the mathematician behind the math behind the bomb and all these the creation of AI and the computer had a very volatile, unsatisfying in some ways life, and his his sort of like motivation was to escape the feeling of irrationality and to escape the feeling that he felt in his bones that something true could also be unprovable. And to a scientist like him or a mathematician, to not be able to prove something was a killer. And so his emotional volatility, but incredible creations like pushed him through because he was motivated by this need to prove it. And then the Candy Darling aspect of a boy wanting to be a woman or transitioning, and like that sort of manifestation of what I know to be true, like what she knew to be true about herself, and that she had to make it happen. And then the culture around her wasn't necessarily accepting it. So I somehow saw these similarities about what makes us human in terms of we have to manifest what we believe to be true.
Hmm.
That's what I suddenly got
I
out because this science, and they both came to sort of early unhappy ends. Um, you could almost say in the service to that motivation that they had to manifest this truth. I find it very interesting about this Hungarian scientist and this Long Island boy who went to Manhattan to find his truth to become a girl. I mean, it's just so interesting. Anyway, those two books are what I read lately.
Well, I think such an interesting point that you're bringing up, and I've said this before, but there are, I think, truths about the human condition that are always there, right? We tend to look back in history and think, oh, we have no connection, or it's nothing like, back then our lives are so different. It's not like the 1600s anymore. It's not, right? But in the 1600s, people loved their kids,
Mhm.
right? People still had probably the stress of providing for their family. Like, I mean, there were just Romeo and Juliet happens back with Shakespeare, and that story is retold in 100 different ways since then.
Right.
Right? There are
Exactly.
just basic truths that I think are always exist and are always with us, and they keep intertwining their way into every generation.
Right.
Maybe the names change and the details or the journey changes a little bit, but that underlying truth, it's always there, isn't it? And it binds us together in a way. That's one of the great things about reading in books. It shows how people are always, they're different but the same, that
Mhm.
it kind of binds us all together, no matter where you are in the world, no matter what you're doing, no matter what generation or world you lived in. um, you all had the same things in common, right? Everybody loved their kids, and
Yeah,
everybody, no matter where you are, right? That people had dogs they loved, and that just, it, we're bound together, I think, across
yeah.
humanity.
And you'd think that would be a limited way to discover the world, but it's not. Like I talked on the podcast a lot about how I kept reading because I wanted to find these persistent truths, like what persists. It's a word I used a lot about. That's why during the pandemic, I started loving to go back to classics, like books I hadn't read, because I wanted to read something from 1850 to see how we're different and the same. Like I wanted to see, oh my God, that's exactly what we do now. It's like to see what truths of human life persist and to
Love
see
that.
if you can just glean from that a truism about the human condition. I mean, that keeps me reading. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate your enthusiasm and enthusiasm for me and the podcast and the inspiration it gave you. It means a great deal. So this is a memory. This is a story I can tell in the future when someone says, "What did you like about your child?" Well, I inspired someone to read Anna Karenina. So thank you.
You absolutely did. That's all on you.
For better
Um,
or worse.
but I want to thank you. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for sharing this, your passion. We're definitely aligned in that regard. And I do hope you come back as you continue reading and you want to, talk about new books. And I hope you come back with your podcast. Again, I miss it.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
And on that note, I'm going to close the podcast. I want to thank Frank Collerius for being here from the New York Public Library, Jefferson Market branch. If you want to go check out, to maybe meet Frank or check out the building that he's so fondly talked about throughout today's chat. I'm I'm sad to say goodbye today because, Frank shares my passion for books in the library, and it's really been a true pleasure for me to get this opportunity to talk to him. I recommend if you're looking for other podcasts, certainly all the old episodes are still up there. The Librarian is in. Go back and listen. He had a great time for years with different co-hosts chatting about the library, its renovation, books, different books that both he and whatever co-host he was with were reading at the time. So all those episodes are still out there. I hope we've coaxed Frank into coming back to reigniting his podcast again. And before I say goodbye, I will say one more thing. For those of you who maybe think of the library as some place where you used to hang out at a necessity by force when you were in school for those brief period of time while you were in school, go back, check it out. There's so much going on at the library, as I tried to highlight throughout this episode. There's not only books, there's museum passes that you can get. There's a sense of community that you can check out movies and music and video games, all for free, all as a service to the community. As Frank said, you're all going to share these things and then return them. Um, it's a place to be for quiet and maybe to go if you're lonely, even to go and read a book and you're not so isolated. Maybe you're alone, but in 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 privacy to the extent that you're sitting at a table reading on your own. But there are other people around you, and certainly there's the busyness of the library that sits around you, so you can feel part of something. I'm a big fan of the library, so I hope I've inspired somebody to go check out their local library, get yourself a library card, um, and check out a book, check out a museum pass, see what it's all about. Okay, I'm gonna say goodbye. From It May Interest You to Know. I've enjoyed my hour enormously. Thank you.